Alrighty, what we're going to do here is a little bit of a blend. We're going to definitely look at some history and pick up where we last left off with the Protestant Reformation. Just quickly review that for a moment, then move on into the 17th century and into the 18th century. Note a couple of other important things which are going on. Kind of transition then into what's going to be the main focus here, into the development of evangelical Christianity in the early 18th century in America. And then after looking at two of the most important figures there, Jonathan Edwards and the Reverend George Whitefield, we'll look at a poem by Phillis Wheatley about George Whitefield and take a little closer look at her work. So we're just going to take a 2-minute or less review of where we left off in a previous lecture about the Protestant Reformation. So we'll remember that in 1517, the Protestant Reformation began with Martin Luther in 1517. 1536, John Calvin publishes the first edition of his Institutes of the Christian Religion. Calvin's going to be the most important theologian who is influential in the Reformation. Then we will remember that King Henry VIII breaks from the Pope and the Catholic Church in the 1530s and 1540s, not for religious freedom for his subjects, but for personal reasons. His daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, reigns from 1558 to 1603, and England is Protestant underneath her, but she has a sort of very effective middle road to Protestantism, which keeps some of the remnants of Catholicism, although she's definitely has continued the break from the Catholic Church started by her father. And but in many ways, it's the Church of England in this time period is still has these different components to it that are, for some people, still too Catholic. So for people like William Bradford and others who want to purify England, the Church of England, of all these things that they still see as ornamental and not valid of their real religious experience, who were then called Puritans. And then in 1630, Anne Bradstreet arrives with John Winthrop, and that's the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So now what I want to do is just take a moment to kind of broadly sketch out, because we're going to be getting and kind of looking at things in the 18th century in just a minute, but I think it's valuable to just have kind of a short thumbnail sketch of maybe looking at a few centuries and just kind of plotting out in Western civilization what are some things that we can just kind of remember as like the most important historical occurrences literally in each century. So we talked briefly in an earlier lecture about the Renaissance, which begins in the 1300s in Italy. And so we can think of that takes place over over a century as well. So we can think of in the 1400s, what's the most important thing that we can remember historically about Europe, about Western civilization, and that's the Renaissance. So that's the 1400s. The 1500s, probably the Protestant Reformation. Then the 1600s, we get here to this slide, the Scientific Revolution. So let's talk just about that for a moment, and then we'll move up into the 18th century as well, and then get to the genesis, really, of evangelical Christianity in America. So as we note there in the very first timeline, Copernicus on the Revolution of the Heavenly Sphere. So that's published in 1543. Literally, when Copernicus is on his deathbed, he's fearful, as he should have been and was, about publishing something which was pretty radical. So this is usually seen as the first incident in what will, much later be thought of as the scientific revolution of the 17th century, which he lays out. Copernicus, that in fact what we're observing up in the heavens is heliocentric. It's what will later be called a solar system, and it's really shattering the previous notion of 1,000 years of Earth as being the center of the heavens, and that idea, which was so firmly implanted in the minds of people, like I said, for 1,000 years, was founded from Greek thinkers, really, from Aristotle and Ptolemy, but then it was really built up by medieval Catholic theology and all sorts of ideas about what was in the heavens. So this was a real radical shift in 1543 to move from that Ptolemaic model of the Earth being at the center of everything to, a solar system. So just to name a couple other things, and then we'll move on here. Johannes Kepler, laws of planetary motion. Galileo builds a telescope in 1609. So if we just to kind of think about if there's one incident that we can say, oh, this is really the scientific revolution is taking off. It's Galileo saying, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to observe the planets, and I'm going to record and then make mathematical calculations and analyses of these things, and then deduce from this, what's really going on out there. So that's the scientific revolution in a nutshell, is, observing something, analyzing it mathematically, and coming up with something based on that using logic. Then we have, as I put in the next couple slides there, Bacon, Descartes. Although the foundation of the scientific revolution is certainly something like Galileo is doing. There's also basically the introduction of logic, inductive reasoning that we think of with Sir Francis Bacon, and I put Descartes up there, who so this is the most famous line that people know of his, and it's an important line. I think, therefore I am. He wrote that in 1637, and what he was referring to there. So Descartes, writing this, very intelligent person, and thinking and he's usually considered, with this work in 1637, not only is it a part of the scientific revolution, but it's literally the founding of modern philosophy. And why is that? And what is he saying there? What's the context of it? I think, therefore I am. Well, because by the 1630s, Descartes is writing, and he's saying, listen, all of the old ideas that I was taught in university, all of the things which I believe from theology, from philosophy, all of those things we're finding out are completely untrue. They're unfounded. And so he says in this essay in 1637, he's saying, I've got to wipe away everything that I don't know and really get down. I'm going to start with the most basic assumptions I can, and I'm not going to assume that anything that I've learned before, again, from theology, from philosophy, from history, I'm not going to assume that anything that has been published up until now is true, because I found out that so many things are false. So what's his... So then he says, first of all, I'm going to base just only on things that I can understand and see and think about and make a deduction about. So the primary thing that I'm going to use is my mind, and that's really the first thing that's what he says is the first and only order of business is establishing what I can know, how I can know it, and I only know that I'm thinking. I'm going to wipe away everything else. That's going to be the beginning. I am thinking. I know that. I can sense that. It's consciousness. Therefore I am. And that's going to be so. And it's really, beautiful and a radical change. Like I said, the founding of modern philosophy and really epistemology, because it's the sense of what can human beings know, and how can we know those things? So anyway, we tend to think of the scientific revolution as reaching its apex in 1687 with Isaac Newton. And just really briefly, so why is this work so important? Well, it's and as you can probably hear a plane flying overhead right now. Thank you. So that was a little symbol of why it's important, because what Newton sort of fused together were earlier things from Kepler, from Galileo, and the little idea about, which probably didn't happen, but the idea of him sitting and thinking about things under a tree and an apple falling on his head, him quote unquote discovering gravity. Like I said, which probably didn't happen, but the symbol of that is pretty good, because what he did is he just said, oh, I'm recognizing and I'm fusing together that the same physical laws which can be expressed in mathematical formulas, the same physical laws which govern celestial bodies, planets orbiting the sun, moons orbiting planets, those same laws also govern an apple falling down. So anyway, there we go. So again, that reaches, like an apex in 1687. Of course, the scientific revolution doesn't go away. It just establishes what we now take for granted. Great. Now, if we were to sort of kind of boil things down, what is this? What are all these things that I have on the slide here have in common? Well, it's the application of logic, just pure logic, to thinking, writing, discovering, analyzing the physical world. So the application of logic to the physical world. Well, that's going to lead directly into, so the scientific revolution being the most important phenomena in the 17th century in Western civilization, that's going to lead directly into the 18th century and now what we look back on and refer to as the Enlightenment. So let's just take a moment here. We're not going to talk about all these people, just about the first two, really. And so I've written down there Hobbes' Leviathan from 1651, and then it says precursor to Enlightenment, because Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan, published in 1651, is definitely not an Enlightenment work. But what it is it was a precursor to John Locke writing political philosophy. And so if we look at Leviathan by Hobbes and then several decades later, John Locke, what we have there is, again, if we were to reduce or define the scientific revolution as the application of just pure logic and analysis into the physical world, then take that logic and that analysis and apply it to the social world, how human beings interact, what type of government should we have. So Hobbes proposed a certain type of government, thought that people needed a monarch. Of course, he's writing this during the English Civil War, after the beheading of an English king. So it's no surprise that a monarch is an appropriate end for for how a just government should rule. Locke sees things very differently and argues for a constitutional government. Locke is probably sort of thought of as like the beginning of the Enlightenment, and one of the most important figures as well. And then of course Locke influences Jefferson. The Declaration of Independence is and Jefferson even says that he was strongly influenced by not only Locke's ideas, but even his wording. So I think, so for example, like there are places in the Declaration of Independence where it almost reads slightly like Jefferson was plagiarizing Locke. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's a phrase that he borrowed and altered, which Locke had originally wrote life, liberty, and property. So, okay, great. But just to stick with Locke for one moment, so we're going to shift from him, this central early figure in what is now known as the Enlightenment, and to, we could say, really, along with Hobbes, created, modern political philosophy. Locke is incredibly important. And one of the people who read John Locke and loved John Locke was Jonathan Edwards. So now this is where we're going to shift into looking at the origins of evangelical Christianity with this man right here, who's the most important person in the development of that. So who was Jonathan Edwards? Really simply, so he's born in 1703. He's American. He came from a family of ministers. As it says, his maternal grandfather Stoddard was a very well-known and admired minister in Northampton, Massachusetts. And so he was really like groomed for the ministry from birth. Not only, and his father was a minister as well. He attended college at Yale, and he was, so Edwards, we're going to look at one of his sermons in just a moment, just a little bit of it, and see how literally evangelical Christianity is created, just where it comes from. It comes from the early 1730s. But Edwards was a very very serious and very intelligent young man. And he loved, as it says in bullet point number 3, he's influenced by the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment ideas of John Locke. So he loved the fact that he was born into a world where there was so much, well, I guess one could say, like fresh knowledge. He loved Locke. Locke was very logical, very, very logical in his arguments. And what Edwards would do is take that same sort of style and apply it to his theology. So let's we'll get into a divine and supernatural light in just a moment. But so let's be clear. So this what we're going to be talking about here is referred to in American history as the Great Awakening, or sometimes as the First Great Awakening, because in the early 1800s there's another Great Awakening. So the Great Awakening, the First Great Awakening, as it says there, a movement in Christianity which introduces emotion as a primary component of religious experience. And so this is just that very first bullet point, the definition of the First Great Awakening. That is the origin of evangelical Christianity. The word evangelical was used certainly many times before the 1730s, I think even for a couple hundred years. But the thing which Edwards and others did was they felt that emotion had to be a strong part of a Christian's experience. Now, that is a completely different and novel and totally different thing from what had been experienced and believed in by Puritans in a century before that. So this is why we can look back and say, well, this is the beginning of evangelical Christianity. So good. Well, let's go ahead and look directly at one of his sermons and see why he says and believes that. So we're just going to look really quickly in this sermon, which comes from 1734, written by Jonathan Edwards, literally something he preached. And it's called A Divine and Supernatural Light. And we're going to look at just a little passage here in which we can see this. So what I said was in that previous definition, that this is a wholly new thing, and it's the beginning of evangelical Christianity. And it's this idea that one of the central components of being a Christian is feeling. The idea that you should have an emotional response was something that was very novel and different. So let's see what he says about this when he is describing. So the divine and supernatural light is the title of it, and it's the subject of this sermon as well, from 1734. It's the idea. What he's trying to do is, in a sort of Lockean sense, he's trying to use logic to argue, like, what is it that a true Christian, a new true Christian, what will become an evangelical, should feel. So in this blue highlighted part here, he's talking about the ways that a spiritually enlightened person should feel. He does not merely rationally believe that God is glorious, but he has a sense of the gloriousness of God in his heart. So notice the emphasis on heart there. There is not only a rational belief that God is holy and that holiness is a good thing, but there is a sense of the loveliness of God's holiness. There is not only a speculatively judging that God is gracious, but a sense of how amiable God is on account of the beauty of this divine attribute. And we'll read just a little bit more into the next paragraph. There is a twofold knowledge of good of which God has made the mind of man capable. So what he's going to do is lay out here, there's two ways that a human being, according to Edwards, is capable of knowing good. These two ways come from God. So the first, and then I'm right here. So the first way, that which is merely notional, as when a person only speculatively judges that anything is, which by the agreement of mankind is called good or excellent, namely that which is most to general advantage, and between which and a reward there is a suitableness, and the like. Okay, so what he just said there, it's easy to get lost in his prose, is that you just sort of speculatively know something, and it's rational, and it's from knowledge, thinking about it basically. Now, let's look at what he says here. And the other way of understanding good, understanding God, and the other is that which consists in the sense of the heart, as when the heart is sensible of pleasure and delight in the presence of the idea of it. In the former is exercised merely the speculative faculty or the understanding. So that's the former way of believing in God or having your experience of God, is the speculative understanding faculty, but that is in distinction from the will or disposition of the soul. And then in pink highlighted there, in the latter, the will or inclination or heart are mainly concerned. So what we can see there is what will become what we can see there is what I suggested here, is that the most important thing is a feeling of being connected with God. And so it wasn't just the feeling in you, but also, now Edwards wasn't an extravagant, well, he was a fire and brimstone type of preacher often, but the effect of his sermon also had an emotional impact on others. So, all right, let's go down to, so then at the bottom of this, the last two bullet points, we see the Reverend George Whitefield meets Edwards in the fall of 1740. Whitefield preaches on both sides of the Atlantic. So, again, just to sort of be clear, the First Great Awakening is this movement in Christianity, which begins in 1730s and several decades of revivals, tent revivals, and it's the idea that people should be moved by the sermon. All of these things are brand new. And so somebody else George Whitefield has read of Edwards. Edwards was becoming, very well known, and his things were published and brought over to England. And so George Whitefield reads about him, and George Whitefield is going to be the second and eventually much more important figure in the development of evangelical Christianity. So let's find out just a little bit about him. So he's English. He's born in 1714. He attends Oxford. He's close with the Wesley brothers, basically the people who were trying to reform the Church of England. And in so doing, with Whitefield, created what is now the Methodist Church. 1738, his first visit to Georgia. So, the state of Georgia. Well, it's not a state in 1738. It's still a colony, the colony of Georgia. And so that's his first visit to America in 1738. And in 1740, as it says, he preaches to Jonathan Edwards' congregation. So this is a really pivotal and important moment. So, like I said, Whitefield had read about and the sermons of Jonathan Edwards, was very impressed by him, wanted to meet him, wrote to him. Edwards invited him to Massachusetts. And so this is the fall of 1740. Edwards even allowed Whitefield to, not only did he meet him, but Edwards invited George Whitefield to preach there to his congregation. I think it was like 4 days in a row. So now, in a way, that's kind of this is a little bit of a simplification on my part, but we could say that it's kind of like a handing of the baton in some ways, because what's going to happen, that's in 1740. Edwards, although he's so important and so pivotal in changing the way people, and he was a revivalist as well, so important in changing the way people are thinking about and experiencing Christianity in the 1730s, he's also maybe going to take it a little bit farther than his congregation is comfortable with, and by 1750, they fire him. They literally, he had a habit of calling out the names of important people in the town, powerful people in the town who weren't attending church, and trying to sort of publicly shame them. So they ended up getting rid of Jonathan Edwards in 1750, but not before he helped George Whitefield. Now, so Whitefield, extremely dramatic, and something that is important to understand. So Whitefield, as it says at the bottom there, he becomes internationally famous, preached at least 18,000 times. So for the next 30 years, George Whitefield, he literally becomes the most well-known minister on two continents. The most well-known minister on two continents. Some people have said he's the first important American cultural figure, even though he's English. And part of the reason for his fame and the fact that literally thousands of people would go to see him preach outdoors was because when he was a little kid, he had an interest in theater, and he loved reading plays out loud. He loved reading plays out loud and acting them out. And then when he became a minister, he still had this love for drama. And so he could speak in this really great loud voice. He would literally act out Bible passages, almost like a one-man show. So it sounds interesting. It's no wonder that people wanted to, besides just the fact that they really connected with what he was saying as a minister. But, imagine, he's sort of basically, acting out some, important scene from the Old Testament, but I know that he did, when Abraham is ready to sacrifice his son Isaac. So you think about the drama that's involved in that, and he's sort of acting that out. Anyway, so he had a strong interest in theater, and it's maybe a little bit hard to believe because of just how many people would go to see him. Literally thousands. Well, you think, well, how is that possible? Because it's the 1740s and 50s. It's not like he had a PA system or anything. But, one of the people who was skeptical of that number himself was Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin heard that, and he just couldn't believe, there's no way thousands of people can hear one person preaching. Benjamin Franklin went to see George Whitefield preach in Philadelphia. And so Benjamin Franklin wrote about this. Franklin and Whitefield became friends. Franklin and Whitefield became friends. And so Franklin had a print shop, and Whitefield published many things through Benjamin Franklin's print shop. But Franklin attended one of his sermons, an outdoor sermon that was literally in Philadelphia, I think on the steps of the courthouse or something like that. So Franklin is there. He's like, well, this guy really is loud and dramatic. And Franklin, in the middle of the sermon, because Benjamin Franklin's a science and technology type of guy, right? It's like, how far does his voice carry? So Franklin, this is true, walked away from the sermon because he wanted to measure how far away he could get from George Whitefield and still hear his voice. And Franklin claimed that he could get 500 feet away from Whitefield and still hear him and still hear what he was talking about. So, and Franklin even then was like, oh, let me calculate how many people could hear him if there were, a certain number of people, one person per 2 square feet or something like that. And then Franklin was like, yep, that literally thousands of, I think he came up with a number of over 10,000 would be able to hear him. So anyway, all right, so that's George Whitefield. So again, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, these two people, one minister from Massachusetts and the other from England, but Whitefield preached in America for decades. Matter of fact, he would go back and forth. He preached in Scotland and England, and as it says there at the bottom, some 18,000 events. And he, as I tried to explain, was very expressive and emotional and dramatic. And so that is the beginning of evangelical Christianity, is with Whitefield, with Edwards, with those two more than anybody else. But then there are lots of other people as well, too. So Whitefield dies in 1770, and that's where we're going to shift and look at someone else now. Whitefield dies in 1770. At that point, like I said, he is the most famous minister on two continents. And Phillis Wheatley, who we're going to get into in just a moment, who's only a teenager, maybe 17 years old, when Whitefield dies in 1770, she thought very highly of him. She met him in person. As a matter of fact, he may have stayed So Phillis Wheatley is a slave, and we'll talk about her biography in just a moment. Whitefield may have stayed with the Wheatley family that owned Phillis Wheatley in Boston on more than one occasion. So she probably not only had seen him preach, but had literally met him several times personally. So she writes a poem called On the Death of the Reverend Mr. George Whitefield. We'll look at in just a moment. This poem made Phillis Wheatley mildly famous, I should say, because he was so beloved, and her poem, which we'll look at in just a moment, is a very good poem. So let's talk just before we get into that poem. We'll look for a moment at Wheatley's biography. Alrighty, so there we have Phillis Wheatley. So we don't know exactly when Phillis Wheatley was born, probably around 1753, probably in what is present-day Gambia, named after the slave ship which brought her over to Boston Harbor. She was purchased by John Wheatley, I believe his first name was. This would have been around 1761, so she's 7 years old maybe when she is sold in Boston. And then it says, bullet point number 3, purchased by wealthy progressive Christians. So this family that bought her, this white upper class wealthy Boston family, the Wheatleys, who purchased her, they taught her to read and write, and she not only English, but within a few years she had mastered English. So remember, she's 7, maybe 8 years old when she's purchased. They teach her to read and write English also because they're an educated, very progressive family. She begins to learn Latin and Greek and composes poetry. Now, so the next bulleted point there, it says in 1770, George Whitefield dies. She writes this poem about him, and it's published in newspapers in both America and in England, and she becomes mildly famous for that. Now, what happened with Phillis Wheatley next? So it says 1772, oral examination by governor, clergy, and judges. So what happens is her owner, she's still a slave, she's still owned by Mr. Wheatley, and they try to, John Wheatley and Phillis try to publish a manuscript of her poems in Boston. Nobody will publish it because the publishers don't believe that a black slave could have written these excellent poems, so they just won't publish them. Mr. Wheatley sets up a meeting with no less than 18 of the most powerful people in Massachusetts to give her an oral examination, including the governor, the lieutenant governor, members of the clergy of the most important and powerful churches in Boston, judges. So literally there are 18 old white men who are going to test her in some way, and make sure that these poems, which her and John Wheatley want her to be able to publish, are they her own. Now we don't know anything about what happens at this other than all of them, and also one of them not only is the governor of Massachusetts, I think Thomas Hutchinson at the time, the governor of Massachusetts, the lieutenant governor, all these important people, judges, pastors, etc. John Hancock himself is one of the people in this group of 18. Like I said, we don't know exactly what they asked her or what went on, but I'm going to read to you just a little, what I think is a fascinating little speculation. This is written about that by Henry Louis Gates Jr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. is a famous English professor who's still alive now. He's an English professor at Harvard. He's got a couple of documentaries that he does on PBS, so people sometimes know him from that. But he's an English professor and a scholar of African American literature. Anyway, so I'm just going to read this little thing which Henry Louis Gates Jr. wrote, sort of speculating about what this true, incident was like, where she was examined by all of these important people. So this is this is Henry Louis Gates Jr. writing about this. We can only speculate on the nature of the questions posed to the fledgling poet. Perhaps they asked her to identify and explain, for all to hear, exactly who were the Greek and Latin gods and poets alluded to so frequently in her work. Perhaps they asked her to conjugate a verb in Latin, or even to translate randomly selected passages from the Latin, which she and her master, John Wheatley, claimed that she, quote, had made some progress in. Or perhaps they asked her to recite from memory key passages from the texts of John Milton and Alexander Pope, the two poets by whom the African claimed to be most directly influenced. We do not know. So I just sort of like that, that sort of speculation from Professor Gates about, what was this like, this oral examination? Well, she passed. Whatever happened, because the 18 men wrote wrote something, and then they all signed their names under it, that yes, we do verily believe that these poems were written by Phillis Wheatley. She takes this to England. She goes to England in 1773 with her owner's son, Nathaniel Wheatley. They're going to attempt to get her book published in London, and she's set up to meet some of the most powerful people in London as well. She's supposed to meet King George III, but it doesn't happen. She and Nathaniel Wheatley are called back to America earlier than they had wanted to be, because Nathaniel Wheatley's mother was dying, Susanna Wheatley. But anyway, so in 1773, they go to England. They're there for a couple months in the late spring, early summer. They eventually get they do publish the the book right there, poems on various subjects, religious and moral. And then later that year, she's freed. And so now what we're going to do, so that's just sort of the brief biography of Wheatley. And now let's take a look. What we're going to do before we get into the poem, which, she had written in 1770 about George Whitefield, we'll read a shorter poem, which is really highly anthologized. The title of it is On Being Brought from Africa to America. And it's a good introduction to her work. So here we go. Okay, great. So, On Being Brought from Africa to America, 'twas mercy. Now, so what you'll notice here, and there are 8 lines, in the first 4 lines, it's going to come off very humble, she's very Christian. Sometimes people occasionally read these first few lines, and they're like, oh, she's being sarcastic. Phillis Wheatley was not a sarcastic woman. So she's very heavily Christian in all of her writings. So, 'twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Now, let's see how she kind of complicates things in these next 4 lines. Some view our sable race with scornful eye, their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. So, what is she doing in that those last 2 couplets? Is so some view our sable race, sable being black, with scornful eye, their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain. So, the allusion there to Cain is, so Cain slew his brother Abel. I believe that's Genesis, probably the 4th chapter. And the unfortunate, terrible racist belief by many people in the 18th century was that, so after, Cain kills Abel, it says, God put a mark on him and banished him. It tells us God put a mark on him and banished him. And so there was this racist notion in the 18th century that's why people in Africa were dark-skinned, that they were somehow descendants of Cain. So what she's doing here is she's taking that trope, and she's also, there's almost a little bit, she's like chiding people and saying, some view our race with scornful eye. But remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined. Refined meaning here, literally, that's a euphemism meaning not just refined, but become Christian. So, okay. We will go on to the death of the Reverend Mr. George Whitefield in one moment. So like it says there, the first two couplets seem to attest to an enthusiasm of a sincere convert to Christianity. However, the second half of the poem is an indictment of white Christians. So that's why this is sort of this. She'll do a similar thing in the next poem that we're going to look at, and it comes off. It is very Christian. There's no doubt about that. She's very, very strongly Christian, and those that comes out. Her faith comes out all the time in her writing. It's the basis of her writing. But then there's also always something just a little bit deeper. So, great. Well, before we go on to that, let's look at the poem itself. Okay, great. So here's this poem that she wrote and published when she was 16 or 17 on the death of the Reverend Mr. George Whitefield. So, hail, happy saint, on thine immortal throne, possessed of glory, life, and bliss unknown. We hear no more the music of thy tongue. Thy wonted auditories cease to throng. Thy sermons in unequaled accents flowed, and every bosom with devotion glowed. So she's just praising him, eulogizing him. Thou didst in strains of eloquence refined inflame the heart and captivate the mind. And maybe that's a little bit of a reference, although people weren't saying, oh, this is the beginning of, evangelical Christianity. There was, by this time in 1770, this notion that was part of the experience of being Christian was an inflamed heart. So there we go. Happy we the setting sun deplore, so glorious once, but it shines no more. And maybe in that ninth line, we the setting sun deplore, there's probably a little bit of a pun with sun. So the setting sun deplore is an off, that's used all the time in literature and poetry, as a reference to the end of someone's life, the setting sun. But here maybe the pun with sun is also an S-O-N, maybe it was a reference to the Son of God. So, all right, behold the prophet. So now she's going to describe Whitefield a little bit. Behold the prophet in his towering flight. He leaves the earth for heaven's unmeasured height, and worlds unknown receive him from our sight. There Whitefield wings with rapid course his way, and sails to Zion through vast seas of day. Thy prayers, great saint, and thine incessant cries have pierced the bosom of thy native skies. Thou, moon, hast seen in all the stars of light how he has wrestled with his God by night. He prayed that grace in every heart might dwell. He longed to see America excel. So you're going to want to pay attention a little bit here to what she says about America. He longed to see America excel, which he did. He loved preaching in America. When he died, he wanted to be buried in America, which he was in northeastern Massachusetts. So, he longed to see America excel. He charged its youth that every grace divine should with full luster in their conduct shine. So he was, convincing young people that, you need to be good Christians. That Savior which his soul did first receive, the greatest gift that even a God can give, he freely offered to the numerous throng that on his lips with listening pleasure hung. Now you'll see in the next stanza what happens is there are quotations there. So what we're supposed to do right here, really from here to here, this entire stanza has got a quotation marks around it. So why is that? Well, what she's doing is she's bringing up sort of what would be his voice or what would be his sermon, just as an example, like right into her poem. So, on his lips with listening pleasure hung, it could almost be a colon. What did he say? Here's what he supposedly said. Take him, ye wretched, for your only good. Take him, ye starving sinners, for your food. Ye thirsty, come to this life-giving stream. Ye preachers, take him for your joyful theme. Now, I ask you to kind of pay attention to, she brings up Americans. Now, this stanza right here she does something very subtle, very intelligent. So, take him, my dear Americans, he said, be your complaints on his kind bosom laid. Take him, ye Africans, he longs for you, impartial Savior as his title due. Washed in the fountain of redeeming blood, ye shall be sons and kings and priests to God. Very powerful there. Now, what is kind of interesting. What she does here is, well, we'll finish the poem and then we'll look back at how what she did in that particular stanza that was kind of crafty. Great Countess, we Americans revere. So that's a reference to the woman, the Countess of Huntington, who was the financial backer for the Reverend George Whitefield. So she's just naming this person, this English woman. Great Countess, we Americans revere thy name and mingle in thy grief sincere. New England deeply feels, the orphans mourn, their more than father will no more return. A reference to an orphanage in Georgia that he'd built. So, and that her little mention of Great Countess is really important because later when she goes in 1773, when she goes to London with Nathaniel Wheatley, they will meet with this woman, the Countess of Huntington, and ask if Phillis Wheatley can dedicate her book of poems to the Countess, which is really important. The Countess says yes, and that helps to get Phillis Wheatley, the book published, because now she has this. It can be dedicated to this important woman in England, and in a way, it's like it almost provides what we would call now in the publishing world a platform, because now she has kind of a readership. So anyway, so last stanza. But though arrested by the hand of death, Whitefield no more exerts his laboring breath. Yet let us view him in the eternal skies. Let every heart to this bright vision rise, while the tomb safe retains its sacred trust, till life divine reanimates his dust. Okay, great. So the whole poem's, kind of interesting. But this stanza, which I said, why is this kind of important? So what she does here, if you just kind of notice, she says, "Take him, my dear Americans," he said, "be your complaints on his kind bosom laid, colon." And then in following the colon, "Take him, ye Africans, he longs for you. Impartial Savior as his title due. Wash in the fountain of redeeming blood. You should be sons and kings and priests of God." So the way I put it on the slide is that on the next slide about that is, so look at bullet point number 3. In the poem, she fuses her voice with Whitefield, subtly blends Africans with Americans. So just think about this. You probably didn't even notice it, nor did people at the time, but she said in that stanza that we were pausing on. So first of all, she was recreating her voice. She was kind of fusing her poetic voice as a speaker of the poem with this internationally famous minister. And then, as I wrote there, subtly blends Africans with Americans. So think how, again, it was so subtle you didn't even really notice it. But she says, "Take him, ye Americans," blah, blah, blah. "Take him, ye Africans." So it's almost like what she's doing, if you want to analyze it really closely, is that she's setting up Africans to be a subset of Americans, which is a pretty radical thing to do. And then that last line, it's almost like a combination. You can be sons and priests and kings of God, Africans and Americans. So what she's doing there is really kind of this really powerful thing. Great. So we're going to look at one last poem of hers, which is it's a good poem, and it's also got some strange... the truth behind the poem is also just as bizarre as the poem itself. So it's a poem to George Washington. It's called "To His Excellency General Washington." So the poem is going to be dedicated to General Washington. She sent it along with a letter in 1775. We'll jump right into it right now and see what it was in her letter that she sent to His Excellency General Washington. So, again, this is true. What we're going to look at here. She sends this letter to George Washington. This is, as it says, it's dated October 26, 1775, from Providence, Rhode Island, because what had happened? Well, she has been manumitted by now. That happened to her in late 1773. This is 2 years later. It's the beginning of the Revolutionary War. So the British forces were in control of Boston. The Wheatley family and Phillis moved to Providence, Rhode Island for safety. And so she's writing from Providence to His Excellency General Washington. So let's see what she says in this letter to him up here. Sir, and so just so we're clear, there's no sarcasm here, by the way. This is not sarcasm. This is, she loves Jesus. There's two things that Phillis Wheatley loves: Jesus, and she loves the American Revolution. She's a huge fan of Generalissimo. So, sir, I have taken the freedom to address your Excellency in the enclosed poem and entreat your acceptance. Though I am not insensible of its inaccuracies, you are being appointed by the Grand Continental Congress to be Generalissimo of the armies of North America, together with the fame of your virtues. Excite sensations not easy to suppress, so she's very excited. Your generosity, therefore, I presume, will pardon the attempt. Meaning she's just being humble about her poem. She's like, I want you to read this poem I wrote about you and the revolution. And then she says, Your Excellency's most obedient and humble service, Phillis Wheatley. So let's see what this poem is that she literally sent to George Washington, who is just beginning the fight for the American Revolution in fall of 1775. Celestial choir enthroned in realms of light, Columbia's scenes of glorious toils I write. I'm going to turn on the underlining here so we can get, there's going to be a little note from the Norton editors about Columbia. What does it mean? This reference to America as the land Columbus found is believed to be the first in print. So this is really important here. Let's be clear what the editors are telling us. So Columbia's scenes of glorious toils are right. So what we're supposed to do, what we're supposed to envision is Columbia. When she says that, the word Columbia, she is talking about a personification of British North America, of the colonies, of what will become the United States of America. It's actually easy to do this now because, so for example, so what the Norton editor said there was, this is probably the first time that was ever used in print to personify America in calling America Columbia. And so what's easy to do is just think of like the beginning of a movie by Columbia TriStar Pictures, and you have this painting, this kind of a beautiful romantic painting of a woman, a goddess that looks, a little bit like the Statue of Liberty almost. So just keep that in your mind. That's literally what we're supposed to see when we think of Columbia. It's a goddess, which is the personification of Americans. So Columbia's scenes of glorious toils I write, while freedom's cause her anxious breast alarms, she flashes dreadful in refulgent arms just being like bright, brilliant. See Mother Earth her offspring's fate bemoan, and nations gaze at scenes before unknown. See the bright beams of heaven's revolving light, involved in sorrows in the veil of night. The goddess comes, she moves divinely fair. So again, it helps to have the visual of just like, this giant goddess, really, who is supposed to represent America. The goddess comes, she moves divinely fair, olive and laurel binds her golden hair. Wherever shines this native of the skies, unnumbered charms and recent graces rise. Muse bow propitious, while my pen relates how pour her armies through 1,000 gates, as when Aeolus heaven's fair face deforms, Aeolus just being the Greek god of wind, enwrapped in tempest and a night of storms, astonished ocean feels the wild uproar. The refluent surges beat the sounding shore, or thick as leaves in autumn's golden rain. Such and so many moves the warrior's train. So, in case you got lost there, which is really easy to do, she's describing Columbia, and then Columbia's armies, i.e., American Revolutionary soldiers, are pouring out to do battle with England. Such and so many moves the warrior's train. In bright array they seek out the work of war, where high unfurled the ensign waves in air. Shall I to Washington their praise recite? Enough thou knowest them in the fields of flight. in the fields of fight. Thee first in place and honors we demand, the grace and glory of thy martial band. So she's she starts talking about General Washington right there, and how important he is. Famed for thy valor, for thy virtues more, hear every tongue my guardian aid implore. And we'll just try to quickly go through the rest of this. 1 century scarce performed its destined round, when Gallic powers Columbia's fury found. So the Gallic powers, which she's mentioning there, is so this is the French having lost, just in the decade prior. And so may you, whoever dares disgrace the land of freedom's heaven defended race. So whoever tries to go up against America is going to be disgraced and overpowered, and fixed are the eyes of nations on the scales, for in their hopes Columbia's arm prevails. Anon Britannia droops the pensive head, while round increase the rising hills of dead. Ah, cruel blindness to Columbia's state, lament thy thirst of boundless power, too late. Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side, and every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine, with gold unfading, Washington, be thine. Okay, so we will quickly go back to the slide here. And so she composed that, and so just to kind of what is the significance of this poem? Well, she's kind of conflating a Christian heaven with Greek mythology in a poetic conceit to support the American Revolution. So it's all pro-Columbia, pro-Washington, pro the Revolution. She presents Columbia as morally superior to Britannia. So she sends this to General Washington, and then what's amazing, so she sends it to him, then as it says in bullet point number 3, Washington's military secretary publishes the poem. So what happens is Washington gets her poem and note while he's involved with the beginning of the American Revolution. He reads it, likes it. His secretary decides to publish it in the newspapers. So her poem gets published to His Excellency General Washington. And then we even still have, what happens is General Washington sends a thank you note to her. And it's pretty short, and I'm going to read it. So this is what George Washington sent back to Phillis Wheatley to thank her for the lovely poem. Miss Phillis, your favor of the 26th of October did not reach my hands till the middle of December. Time enough, you will say, to have given an answer ere this, granted. But a variety of important occurrences, continually interposing to distract the mind and withdraw the attention, I hope will apologize for the delay, and plead my excuse for the seeming but not real neglect. I thank you most sincerely for your polite notice of me in the elegant lines you enclosed, and however undeserving I may be of such encomium and panegyric, the style and manner exhibit a striking proof of your poetical talent. So he's so humble and sweet and nice to her in this letter. In honor of which, her poetical talents, and as a tribute due to you, I wanted to publish the poem, had I not been apprehensive that, while I meant only to give the world this new instance of your genius, I might have incurred the imputation of vanity. This and nothing else determined me not to give it place in the public prints. But as I said, his military secretary published it anyway. If you should ever come to Cambridge or near headquarters, I shall be happy to see a person so favored by the muses and to whom nature has been so liberal and beneficent in her dispensations. I am, with great respect, your humble, obedient servant. So that's what General George Washington sent back to her, invited her to Cambridge, Massachusetts. And then, as it says in the last bullet point there, she visits General Washington in March of 1776. Just to be clear, so as we wind this down, it's a kind of amusing and bizarre thing to think that so all of those things happened. He writes his beautiful thank you note back to her, says, if you're ever near headquarters, come back. Well, she does. She goes to visit him in March of 1776, and they met. Nobody knows anything about what their meeting was like, how long it was, or anything like that. But she took him up on the offer and went to meet General Washington. So that's a good way to wind things down on that bizarre and strange moment where she sends a poem to him about how wonderful he is, and he invites her her to meet him, and they do. So there you go. So hopefully this was, as I said, we jumped and touched around a lot of different things here. Kind of tried to start with the where we'd left off with the Protestant Reformation and the Puritans, connect that to the writings of John Locke later on in the late 1600s, and then how that influenced Jonathan Edwards, the American minister, and how Jonathan Edwards and the Reverend George Whitefield were the two people who were responsible for the birth of evangelical Christianity. And then when Whitefield dies, Phillis Wheatley writes a poem about him. So, alrighty, so that's the end of the lecture. Lovely.